Hello.
Hey.
Do I refer to you as professor or doctor? How do you wish to be addressed?
My name is Isabel. That'll
Isabel.
work.
All right, Isabel. Thank you so much. A Pulitzer Prize winner, New York Times bestselling author of Caste, first African-American woman to win a Pulitzer Prize in journalism, former New York Times reporter, author of The Warmth of Other Suns and Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. Thank you so much for joining us. This book was, what made you look at the experience of African Americans in this country through the lens of caste rather than race?
Well, it started with that first book, The Warmth of the Suns, which was about the Jim Crow South and why 6 million African Americans would flee, defect, seek political asylum within the borders of their own country. Why would they do that? What were they leaving? And it ended up that they were leaving a world in which it was against the law for a Black person and a white person to merely play checkers together in Birmingham. You could go to jail if you were caught playing checkers with a person of a different race. And maybe the wrong person was winning or they were having too good of a time, but they felt that the entire foundation of Southern civilization was in peril, could not have it, and literally wrote down a law making it illegal for Black people and white people to play checkers together. That's how extreme and how arcane and how very specific the rules and protocols were of the Jim Crow South. And that actually parallels with a similar impulse and set of rules and expectations within the Indian caste system. One of the pillars is called purity versus pollution, where the subordinated people, the lowest caste people, were not to use the same chalice, the same wells, the same waterways. And the same thing happened here, where actually the water was segregated throughout much of the country, where Black people could not use the same pools, the same beaches. In fact, there was a case in Chicago where a teenager waded into what was called the white water. Water has no color. And then he was stoned to death for having waded into what was perceived as the white water. And that set off one of the worst race riots in our country in Chicago in 1919. So I came to the idea of looking at our country as focusing in on the system of hierarchy that was enshrined in this country going back to the 17th century, that created a hierarchy that put primarily British people at the very top and anyone who looked like them. And then at the very bottom were people who were brought in to be enslaved and to build this country for free. And then, of course, that all began with the stealing of the theft of the land and the genocide of the people who were
already here. Right.
So all of this was creating a hierarchy, and we live with it to this very day.
I'm curious if it was purposeful in the sense that if you're building a new country, do you believe hierarchy then is a necessary element? Must there be in a society a dominant caste and a subordinate caste? And is this something that all societies suffer from, just not to the obscenity and perversion that was? And to give people a sense of it in terms of perspective, the Nazis, when looking to institute their dominant versus subordinate caste, looked to America's racial system of segregation and caste and thought it too severe.
Yeah.
I mean, reading that was devastating.
It's gut-wrenching to realize that the Nazis did not need anyone to teach them how to hate. That they had down pat. But when they were looking for justification and jurisprudence and a legal framework on which to build a reasoning, presumably rationality, to do what they were ultimately going to do, they actually looked to this country, first of all, for the definition of race. I mean, it turned out that our country was more led the world, sadly, in finding ways to categorize people on the basis of the social construct known as race. And through those laws, they had these blood laws, the laws that said, if you had one drop of black blood, you were
Right.
black. For other cases, they would say 1/4 of Chinese blood made you Chinese. The United States had extensive jurisprudence, and the Nazis looked all over the world, and it turned out that they had to come to this country.
Right.
What we often look to South Africa as a country that has an extreme case of racial hierarchy, but
Hmm.
they actually look to the United States as well. Apartheid followed Jim Crow. Jim Crow was set in motion in the
Right.
19th century, and so we were the leaders
Right.
in the Western world.
Not a great we're number one to shout. Not one of
No.
those where you want to get on the hilltops. But it does make me wonder, because it seems pretty clear that the founders of this country valued the union over the ideal. Whatever our founding documents said, they valued the creation of that union far more than they valued following the high-minded rhetoric. And do you know, was that explicit in their discussions and negotiations? And how did this legal framework come into place? Was it borrowed from an English framework? Who were the designers of this incredibly restrictive prison that we built?
Well, interestingly enough, they actually broke from English tradition when they created this, what I would call caste of people who were forced to be enslaved, by tying the status of an individual, of a child, not to
Mhm.
the father, which is what the English law would have said, but to the mother. And what that did was that allowed the founders, the slaveholders, people who were creating basically a slaveocracy, to take possession of any child born to a black woman, and to make sure that that child, any black child, would automatically assume the status of the mother, which would be enslavement. So that's how you had generational inheritable slavery
Mhm.
and servitude that was built into the identity of anyone who was of African descent in this country. So in
So
a way, they actually veered from it and created
right.
a new framework for the hierarchy here.
But it shows, though, this wasn't happenstance. This
Yeah.
wasn't a condition that developed out of some sort of extreme condition. It was designed, it was purposeful, and which makes it, I'm not saying it would have been any better if the intention had been different, but then the cruelty of it is that much more, our country is that much more culpable.
Well, I think that in a way, the intentionality kind of, in a way, it diverts us from the end result. Doesn't matter why the person is whipping this individual at the moment. I mean, if they truly believe that this is their God-given right, that they were born to dominance, they've been programmed to believe that they are over these people, that these people are not even human, so they can do anything they want to them. So in a way, it becomes so encoded for so long, passed down through generations, that it becomes the perceived wisdom, it becomes the convention, it becomes what you expect to be the case. In other words, you come to accept it because it's been in place for so long, passed down through the generations. Even the idea of race itself is a social construct. We've come to believe it to be what it is, but this is a construction. When people arrive from parts of Europe, they might have arrived thinking of themselves as Polish or as Irish or as Welsh or as German, whatever they might have been. They were not thinking of themselves in terms of the current day language of race. But once they entered into the hierarchy that was created in this country, they had to shed that, and they were joining into a pre-existing hierarchy in which they were characterized as something that would have had no meaning back in Europe, but had
Right.
tremendous meaning of power, influence, and entitlements in this country.
Who invented this? Somebody must have made the invention, because I think you just hit on something, which is you think of yourselves as ethnicity, certainly, and Polish and or tribal, where certain tribes or certain things. Where did this idea of race then enter the conversation? Is it at that time of subjugation, or is this something that was a theory that had been talked about and was deployed for the benefit of this dominant caste?
Well, of course, it evolved over the decades of the 17th century,
Hmm.
where clearly they were bringing in people who looked different from themselves, and they used what should have been the neutral physical characteristics that should have no meaning other than just the beautiful range of human manifestation, and they
Hmm.
converted that into a value of hierarchy in which, based upon what you look like, it would be determined whether you could own property or be property. And that was the
Right.
emerging hierarchy that was built out of the fact that they perceived themselves to be needing to build a country out of wilderness. They first tried to enslave indigenous people. They killed off so many indigenous people, drove them from the land, and then, of course,
Right.
the indigenous people had some ways of being able to evade because
Right.
they knew the land.
Right. They knew
Uh,
the landscape.
and it turned out that they tried to do this with Irish indentured servants and others from Europe. But those people could also escape and blend in with the landowners and the powers that be, who were the British. And so they found that here were a group of people who could not escape. They were readily visible. They turned these otherwise neutral characteristics into a value that determined who could do what in the country.
And once established, as it sunk in, and you talk about this, it takes on its own momentum, its own inertia, and you talk a little bit in the book about these scientific experiments where the blue eyes are given,
Yep.
dominance over the brown eyes, and how those experiments play themselves out. They set it up as sort of this bifurcated system, whiteness and blackness, and then they start to expand whiteness
Yes. Yep.
when they need that. And how does that play into the perpetuation of a system like this?
Well, what it does, I mean, it's actually like diabolically brilliant, because what it does is it creates the uppermost group is then, because of the power wielded by those in the uppermost group, not everyone in the uppermost group, but the group itself.
Right.
And then that means anyone entering that society has to figure out, how do I survive in this hierarchy? How do I survive in a world in which people who look like this are at the very top and they control and own virtually everything? This is going back to the founding of the country. And
Right.
then those who are at the very bottom have no rights, not even over their own bodies. And how does someone coming in figure out where they fit in and how will they survive? And that creates this sense, in order to survive, I must accede to and be in the good graces of those who are at the very top.
Hmm.
It creates this natural human impulse to want to be more like those who are in power in order to survive.
Right.
I mean, in some ways, I don't blame people for the natural response to survive. I'm just saying that what it does is it programs everyone into the belief system,
Right.
and to act in accord with what is required in order to survive in a pre-existing hierarchy such as ours. And it's been going on for so long, it's 400 years in the making, that it has been so set in the ways in which we move about that we don't even see it. That's the power of it. It's almost
Right.
invisible.
And you even talk about how it's also absorbed by the caste that has been designated as
Yes.
lower, that
Yes.
that the people in that caste start to absorb the lesson
Yeah.
of them being lesser.
Yes.
And the dominant caste even relies on perverting some in that caste for their aims, to police the others, on plantations and in concentration camps, and things like that. How do you elevate a group that's been subjugated like that? How do you begin to dismantle it? And is it something, you talk about in India, it's there for thousands and thousands of years, and it's not race-based. It's just sort of, they've decided.
Yeah. Yeah.
The experiences you have at conferences where an upper caste Indian woman, and you can spot her, you can spot that she is upper caste in the way that she talks to somebody who is giving a presentation, who has studied the Dalits or has studied the untouchables, and walks and just thinks nothing of stepping in and correcting it.
Yeah, this is the way in which we have all been programmed. I mean, the programming is in every sphere of our society. It's from the billboards and the commercials to who dies first in a movie, when you see like it's everywhere. It's
right. And one of my favorites was the scholar that you went to, and I can't remember where the conference was where you met him. He was, I think, a Brahmin. He was somebody from a caste there. And he would say, like, I'm from the warrior class. And you're like, he's like 5'7". He's like, 5'7", 130 pounds. You're
exactly.
Like, all right, that's fair enough. If that's your caste, that's your caste.
He was a geologist.
Boy, does it show you, though, just the arbitrary and incredibly strange nature of all this.
It's everywhere. So we've all been programmed as to who is valued in our society and who must be protected at all costs, and whose lives do not matter, as much as we have the Black Lives Matter movement as a result of the recognition of the ongoing quest for equity and recognition of the humanity of people who've been subjugated for so long. This actually, I mean, what it means is that everyone becomes, in some ways, a participant, whether we choose to or not, because this is what we've inherited. I mean, one of the things that I say, one of the metaphors that I like to use to help us to see this is, in recent years, it's not been unusual to hear people say something to this effect of, this is not America, or I don't recognize my country, or this is not who we are.
That's right.
Well, that means that we, the majority of Americans, have been deprived of the opportunity really to know our country's true and full history. And if you knew our country's true and full history, you would realize that our country is like an old house. It's like an old house. And if you inherit an old house, if you take possession of an old house, you did not build the uneven pillars and joists and beams. You did not build the frayed electrical wiring. You did not build the corroded pipes that you're now having to deal with. But when you take possession of an old house, guilt and shame are not going to help you fix it. You have to look at that building inspector's report and see what is it that we're dealing with. And then you don't get emotional about it. You roll up your sleeves and you get to work in fixing that. And, while you didn't build those uneven pillars and joists and beams and the frayed wiring and the corroded pipes, any further deterioration is on the hands of those who are in possession of that old house now. It is on people who are here now to take responsibility.
That's where it diverges somewhat. Because, and that's such a great metaphor about the house. And now imagine that the people who live in that house become resentful and decide that it's actually your fault that it's like this, and they're going to let it go to more decay. That's the thing that is so hard to wrap your head around. You have a founding document that states the inalienable rights given to all humans of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that all men are created equal. And for a subjugated group to ask for that as though it is a negotiation, the document says, granted by God, not by Senator Calhoun of South Carolina. Like, the idea that has been an ongoing negotiation is the real shame of this years later, that everybody thinks now, like, hey man, you got your Civil Rights Act, so we're done here. And where does that resentment come from?
Well, there are a whole lot of answers to that. I mean, one of them is that I think that we are in a crisis of identity. I think we're in an existential crisis in this country, in part because of 2042. Or 2045, that's the year in which the United States has been projected to have a demographic configuration different than anything any of us have ever known, which would mean that we no longer would have the historic majority that all of us have grown accustomed to, would no longer be in the historic majority. That is a configuration that no one alive knows or has experienced ever. This affects everybody up and down the hierarchy in all segments of our society. And I think that there's this recognition that this is impending and this is a challenge. There's language that political scientists use, which is dominant group status threat, which means it's another way of talking about the existential crisis of what happens when we are all accustomed to a particular configuration as to who is in power, who has this, and who's to be where. And then that changes. And then what happens when those who had been subjugated and that everyone has grown accustomed to seeing at the bottom, what happens when they rise? What happens when there's opportunity for them? What happens when, if there's this sense that if people who've been at the bottom begin to move up, then that diminishes. It's not true, but it's a view that it diminishes the role and power and value of the people who've been programmed to see themselves as dominant all along.
How crazy. The literal interpretation of the American dream is it doesn't matter where you were born or how you were born or who you are, that in this country, you can rise up and go beyond that. And it turns out to be a fallacy. But I wonder, when we say, in 2040 or 2050, when the demographics change and we won't know what will happen, I feel like we know what will happen because it's what's happened from the very beginning. And I would say, the formation of the Union, the compromise that was made with the Southern states that Black slaves would count as 3/5, but they can't vote, but you can count them. There has always been a redistribution of power to the white elite. And it happened every time. Right after the Civil War, what happened? Black people began to rise up. They began to get economic power. They began to get legislative power. They began to live the dream that this country is supposedly made of. And so what did they do?
There's a backlash and there's a sense of threat, that, again, dominant group status threat, when the historic configuration seems to be challenged and people take it personally. And I also believe that this is a response to manufactured scarcity, the sense that there's not enough for everyone, the sense that it leads to the insecurities that are part of what happens when you have a caste system that pits people against one another in order to survive. And this is here and all over the world. And so that's what we're looking at. But what 2042 or 2045, whichever year ends up being, is an opportunity for us as a country to reimagine who and what we can be. It's a chance to incorporate all of the pieces of our identities and incorporate it and make it into a stronger union. I mean, that's the opportunity that we have. What will the country do? Will people get transfixed on fear and insecurity and the threat, or will they see this as an opportunity to truly lead the world as the United States perceives itself to lead the world in finding a way to have a true multiracial democracy, a true multiracial society that offers, justice and liberty for all of us. I mean, that's the goal, and that's what we're facing. If we can rise past it, if we can recognize, first of all, we need to stop talking about African Americans as if they have not been in this country since before the country was founded. We need to recognize that this is not, when we talk about slavery and Jim Crow, we're not talking about African American history. We're talking about American history. This happened as a result of the laws, the protocols, actions of the state and of individuals in power to keep an entire group of people in a fixed place at the very bottom of society, excluded from the body politic, excluded from the fruits of the economy, excluded in every sphere of life. And that also need to remind ourselves that this idea of African Americans being mainstreamed into our society is a very new proposition. We're in the adolescence of this effort to reach equity and equality in this country. It only goes back to the 1960s. Anyone born before 1965, with the Voting Rights Act, were not permitted to vote. After the majority of African Americans were prohibited from being able to vote. So that means that this is very new. This is very, very new, and we have barely begun to make progress in the ways that we need to. And as soon as there is any progress, then of course, as you mentioned, there's this backlash, there's this retrenchment, there's this sense of fear and threat
and
that
denial. So much of it is denial. Right.
And I also wanted to say that when it comes to that house, so if you stop looking at what's wrong with the house and you start trying to blame people, then the house is not going to get fixed. We're all in this house. That means that all of us suffer if we don't fix this house. I mean, we all suffer.
That's a beautiful point. And that's the thing that the resentment, I think, never begins to address. And it's so interesting that the idea that history stops in 1964 or 1965 and that scaffolding isn't in place is really embedded in people's minds. And we just had it on the show, name one systemic issue of racism. A lot of people can be bigoted, but name one systemic thing. And you name 10, Homestead Act, GI Bill, New Deal, subject change. The idea that if you build something that intentionally over 400 years, you have to dismantle it with the same intentionality. And that doesn't mean like 3 extra points on your college admission test. That's not it.
The issue is that we, as a country, most people have not had a chance to know how we got to where we are. I mean, I can say that as a result of whenever people respond to the books that I've written, both Warmth of the Suns and Caste, one of the things I hear time and time again is, I had no idea. I had no idea this happened in our country. I had no idea this happened.
They're trying to make it illegal. They're trying to make it illegal for you to have an idea. That's what's crazy.
And not having an idea has consequences. It affects how people view their fellow citizens. It affects how they view policies. It affects how they vote. I mean, it affects everything. It affects where they send their children to school, where they choose to live. It affects everybody. So it's time that people have an idea. It's time that we all have an idea. These are challenges that as a country, if we don't deal with them, they're not going to go away. I mean, one of the things that I make reference to a lot is the idea that our country is kind of like a human being, a body that has a pre-existing condition, like heart disease or diabetes or alcoholism, whatever it might be. When you have inherited a chronic condition, you don't expect that you take one pill, I'll do this one thing, and I'll be good. I don't have to think about it again. Right. You don't expect that there will be one thing you will do, or that you did something back in 2012 and you don't have to think about it anymore. I mean, if you have diabetes or alcoholism, you don't say, okay, I watched my diet and I didn't drink, last year, so I'm good. I can do whatever I want now. No, it's constant work. It's vigilance. It requires constant awareness that this is a chronic inheritance, a chronic condition that we've inherited, and that it requires constant work. Just like that old house. You don't just replumb or get a new furnace and then just think, I'll never have to do anything on the house again. I'm done. I'm good. We're fine. You wouldn't do that.
First of all, now I just feel like I've got to go look in my house and see what's gone wrong, because I'm sure there's all kinds of things that are falling apart. But the other side of it, I wonder how much the immune system of the country, like our information mechanisms, like the news, because you wrote something in the book that was really interesting about the skewed vision we have of African Americans through the news media, that there was 11% of crime committed by African Americans on white citizens. But if you watch the news, it's 46%, it's 52%. So those who would consider themselves the guardians of our context and of our perspective, and would probably consider themselves good liberals, good, nice, moderate, liberal white folk that want to do right, are actually exacerbating and exaggerating this conflict, making it harder to move past these entrenched feelings.
People who are of presumably good intentions and see themselves as fair and just people have been still programmed with unconscious biases. And it's interesting how we want to act as if we don't have these biases when we are human. To be human means you have your experiences. You have ways in which you've been exposed to everything from the time that you were born on until the current moment. And that gives you a particular window onto the world. However, when we're driving our cars, we recognize that we have blind spots. We have rear view mirrors, side mirrors, we got mirrors in the back, we got cameras in the back. I mean, at some point, I think if you get near a car, it starts to, it tells you to back away, whatever. I mean, we have all these protections,
Right.
but we don't do that for the more significant aspects of what it means to be human in our society, to recognize that we have these unconscious biases and that we need to have ways in which we can fill in for those biases and recognize that we have them, as opposed to denying them and then endangering ourselves further as a result of it.
Is this a formal process, do you think, Isabel? Is it something that needs to be codified, not necessarily in law? I mean, I think we have those laws in place, but is this a formal process of, you go to South Africa and Truth and Reconciliation, but is there a more formal process that we can go by that we haven't done through scholarship and through communication that can start this?
To do this book, I spent a lot of time in Germany. I made many trips to Germany to understand what they had done in the decades after the war, the ways that they do everything in that society, in education, and the ways in which they remember history, is they acknowledge what has happened. And acknowledgement is the first step toward reconciliation. In other words, they have converted the places of horror into places of learning. You go into Berlin, there's this massive structure that takes up the center of Berlin, a major world city. And that is the monument to those who perished in the Holocaust. And that all of the monuments that you see are to those who either perished or suffered as a result of the Holocaust, or those who resisted the Holocaust.
No big Hitler statue on a horse in the middle of Berlin with a plaque.
They are addressing their history and they are continuing to reconcile with their history. For example, because of their history, there's no death penalty. I remember speaking to a German woman that said, we don't have the death penalty. After the war, we could not be, after what happened during the war, we cannot be trusted, this woman said, with that. As stunning.
Wow.
It's a crime, a very serious crime, to display any of the Nazi symbolism.
Right.
So they have taken proactive steps to protect against this recognizable condition that they've inherited. We, on the other hand, have not reconciled that. We can't even necessarily agree on what was the cause of the Civil War. We cannot agree on what should happen.
Right.
How should we remember the Civil War, remember our history? We're in the middle of conversations and discussions and contentions about what to do, how we should even tell the story of our country. So we have not begun that. I believe that we should have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think that all of us need to be given the opportunity to know our country's true history. How will we know what is possible if we have not had a chance to know what actually happened?
Do you think, Isabel, it's possible that this is because we lack humility? Germany was humbled.
Yes.
There was an arrogance, obviously, to Hitler's and the Aryan philosophy and a eugenics philosophy. And ultimately, they were humbled in an incredibly destructive and devastating way. And only maybe through that humility, and I'll guarantee you, and you probably know this from being in Germany, there's also an underlying resentment.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of, oh, it's enough already. Okay, we screwed up. Leave us alone. But I think without that humbling, it's hard to put this country on that path, because we tell ourselves this tale of exceptionalism.
Yes.
We are a shining city on a hill, bathed in the glories of the Greek and Roman philosophers and democratic republics and freedom and liberty. And without that humility, boy, it's hard to imagine us tackling it in the honest way that you speak of so well.
Well, I think that humility is an important part of this. I agree. Humility could be fostered if we came to a realization of how we actually compare even to our peer nations. I mean, one of the things that I think is important in terms of looking toward, solutions as to what we need to do is to recognize that we are all as a country
Yes.
suffering as a result of this. We do
Right.
not rank well.
Yes.
We believe ourselves to, and obviously there's a tremendous portion of our country that is, is outrageously, wealthy and having the best that
Mhm.
any human being who's ever lived could ever have.
Right.
At the same time, we as a country do not fare well against our peer nations. I mean, we have the highest maternal mortality rate among our peer nations. We have the highest infant mortality rate among our peer nations. We have one of the lowest life expectancies of our peer nations. We have among the highest gun deaths among our peer nations. In fact, the graphs that show our peer nations and ourselves, if you want to have the gun deaths, you can't even get all of them on the same page, the same graphic, because it's so extreme. And we have to have the lowest life expectancies means it's literally a matter of life and death that these divisions and this history is costing us. And I would say, one of the things that I did was I included in the book these interviews that were conducted of people in London who were asked
Yes.
to try to guess
How much?
how much do Americans pay for
Yeah.
basic things. So they were at, like, one woman says, how much do you think it costs for an American to have a baby? And when she was told it was like $6,000, whatever the number was, she said, what? To have a baby? First of all, they never got them right. So right off the bat, they never got it right. The one person was asked, how much does it cost if an American has an accident and needs to have or gets very, very ill and needs an ambulance to take them to the hospital? And
Yes.
the man's response was, they charge for that? I mean, they just could not believe in it. This is a peer nation. We are alone in the lack of generosity and magnanimity toward our fellow citizens, because a caste system, a hierarchy such as ours, actually pits people against one another and makes people believe that they have no stake in the well-being of their fellow citizens.
Right.
So we are at odds, and we don't see how this actually hurts every single one of us to live in a society that is actually harsher than it needs to be because of the inherited divisions that we have yet to overcome.
It's like going to a doctor and he checks you out and he says, high blood pressure, arthrosclerosis, pleurisy, bad skin. You're good, 100%. Like you've diagnosed all these things, and it's so evident and true, and yet we walk out of it thinking, clean bill of health, we're number one. It's remarkable. I cannot thank you enough, Isabel Wilkerson, for spending the time with us and really enlightening. The book is Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. It is a difficult and necessary read. Really remarkable. You have to come back and talk to us again. It's just, you're really incredible, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.